Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all, according to the region of the world you're participating from. Allow me, on behalf of the Geneva Centre for Human Rights Advancement and Global Dialogue, its staff, and its board of management, which consists of 5 internationally recruited personalities, and on my personal behalf, to warmly welcome our esteemed panelists and thank them for having accepted our invitation to this panel despite their heavy schedules, to share with us their analysis and insights flowing from their remarkable expertise and hands-on field experience at the international, national, and local levels in regard to the subject of this panel. I will be introducing each of the panelists respectively before giving them the floor. Let me also welcome the participants who I see, as Marina has shown on the very graphic screenshot, coming from all parts of the world. It is indeed very encouraging to see your interest, participants, in this issue of vital importance for human rights. Allow me to first briefly present the context of this panel's theme. In 2019, the UN General Assembly unanimously adopted Resolution 73/2371, declaring 2021 as the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labour, which is why we selected the subject of this panel this year. The resolution reaffirmed the commitments by member states to adhere to achievement of SDG 8.7, Sustainable Development Goal, and take, I quote, immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor, end modern slavery and human trafficking, and by 2025, end child labor in all its forms. Unfortunately, while significant progress has already been made, many challenges still remain. The latest global estimates indicate that 160 million children, of which 63 million girls and 97 million boys, were in child labor globally at the beginning of 2020, accounting for almost 1 in 10 of all children worldwide, which, at least to me, is mind-boggling. The COVID-19 pandemic threatens to exacerbate the situation further, pushing more girls and boys, particularly from vulnerable communities, into child labor. This is due to a number of factors, of which, among others, child labor regulations have been weakened in a number of countries, especially in sectors such as agriculture and coffee production. School closures are known to increase the risk of child labor, including exploitative and hazardous jobs. Girls are particularly vulnerable to exploitation in domestic work. Restricted freedom of movement can make it more difficult for social workers to support vulnerable children, putting them at a higher risk of exploitation. Disruption of family ties through illness and death of parents due to COVID-19 can make children more vulnerable to forced labor and human trafficking. And finally, a number of countries have curtailed or put on hold their free meal programs, childcare services, and other social service provisions. Some important reports have been released recently that I believe will later be presented or alluded to by our distinguished panelists. We would like, however, to start with a short 2-minute video whose captions mention some of their findings. Video, please. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching. I would just like to add a few words about the Geneva Centre, which was founded in 2013 and is an independent human rights think tank whose work rests on 4 pillars: research and publication, training of stakeholders, and national capacity building in the field of human rights in specific focus areas. The 4th pillar is cross-cutting and consists of the promotion of human rights globally through international human rights advocacy and through offering platforms such as the organization of international conferences and panel debates to foster intercultural, religious, and civilizational dialogue. The present panel event involves 2 of these pillars. The first one is research and publication, and the second, international advocacy. Research and publication because the proceedings of the panel will be published, comprising a summary of the debates and full statements of the panelists. International advocacy is undertaken through the participants in this panel debate and through universal distribution of the publication on the Geneva Centre's website, which I invite you to visit and discover, and on its social media platforms. Regarding our 4th cross-cutting pillar that I just mentioned, of human rights advocacy, allow me to briefly mention an initiative of the Geneva Centre that has been highly appreciated by all stakeholders, including permanent missions, the United Nations, international organizations, and NGOs. Since 2020, we have closely followed and extensively reported on the Human Rights Council's regular sessions, as well as certain special sessions, the latest of which last month on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To date, since the beginning of this initiative in early 2020, 122 reports have been sent by us in real time and are available on our website. Our next reporting cycle will begin next week on the 47th session of the Human Rights Council. We invite you, if interested, to join our mailing list to receive these reports. I will now open the panel and would like to reiterate kindly that the time allotted to each speaker is around 8 minutes. This would allow all panelists to make their presentations for an equal length of time and leave about 10 to 15 minutes to spare for a question and answer session with participants and also among the panelists, thereby ensuring that the entire panel event does not exceed an hour and a half. Without further ado, allow me to call upon our first panelist, Mr. Philippe Feinunegem, Chief, Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work Branch, ILO. Philippe has worked for ILO in the Côte d'Ivoire, Peru, East and Southern Africa. Before joining the ILO, he was, among others, a research fellow at the Center for Applied Economics of the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and has published several studies on social protection, cooperatives, and other labor-related issues. He thus brings to this panel his high academic expertise and extensive field experience. As many of you will be aware, ILO and UNICEF have just released a new major report on child labor, entitled Child Labor 2020 Global Estimates, Trends, and the Road Forward. So Philippe, could you offer us some insights into this report, the effects of the pandemic on child labor, and perhaps share with us some of the analysis and recommendations? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Umesh, for these kind words. But first, let me thank your staff, also thank the Geneva Centre for Human Rights Advancement and Global Dialogue, who organized this seminar brilliantly. And as part, actually, as it was mentioned, of the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labour, I'm pretty pleased in the name of the ILO to be part of that webinar and to share with such distinguished panelists and specialists, actually, that I just saw in the chat and in your map around the world. As you said, I was asked to start this panel by reviewing the new global estimates and the findings that were released last week. But let me start by pointing out some kind of paradox in which we stand today. As most of you know, the international community and the ILO have made really tireless efforts to eliminate child labor. Already in our early founding of the ILO, which was almost a bit more than a century ago, while we adopt the first convention on the minimum age in the industry. That was a convention number 5. Obviously, after the years and as a standard setting organization, the ILO and its constituents draft several conventions. The basic one that we consider now, it's the Convention 138, adopted in 1973, which set clearly the minimum age for any type of work, and not only in this industry like it was done in Convention 5. And in August 2020, a year ago, we have reached a historical milestone with the universal ratification of the Convention 183 on the worst forms of child labor. And that's really reflect a global commitment that the worst forms of child labor, such as the convention mentioned, slavery, sexual exploitation, the use of children in armed conflicts, or any type of illicit or hazardous work, that compromise their health, their moral, their well-being in general, really has no place in our society. But that's precisely where the paradox lies. While we have those international community commitments to fight against child labor and legal binding instruments, and that the UN has declared year 2021 as the international year to fight and eliminate child labor, the situation for millions of children has not improved. At the pace it deserves, it has deteriorated in a large sense. And that's what the global estimate, our findings as. And let me explain a bit why. For the last 20 years, and we take that time frame, so since 2000, the ILO has collected, analyzed, and released global estimates on a regular basis. Every 4 years, we did that exercise. Until 2016, so 4 years ago, the trend in child labor around the world was constantly decreasing. If we compare the year 2000, we were at about 245 million children working. In 2016, we reached the number of 152, which was the number everybody used up to now, which is a decrease, substantial decrease of 94 million children that went back to school, not to work, as the title of this webinar is about. Unfortunately, last week, the ILO and UNICEF released those global new estimates, and Umesh, you mentioned already the figures of 160 million children in child labor, which is an increase, as you can see, of more than 8 million new children in child labor. And let me enter here in more details of the complexity of the situation behind that global figure. And I would like to give 5-6 elements to understand the panorama of child labor and then pass to the policy recommendation. In terms of the prevalence, in terms of the situation on hazardous work, the workplace, the age of the children, and also the geographic difference. If we take the prevalence first, the prevalence rate actually, which means, as you know, the proportion of child labor that actually are in child labor, this prevalence has not increased nor decreased. It remains stable, which is a problem per se, but at least it has not increased. So it remained at 9.6, which is basically, in easy term, 1 child out of 10 is working today as it was in 2016. What is really worrying is a few things, not only the global figures. It's related to hazardous work. I was talking about the universal ratification of Convention 182. But what we can see at the same time is that the number of children working in hazardous work has actually increased over the last 4 years. This means that all countries have agreed that it's absolutely unacceptable that a child put at risk his health or well-being development. But in reality, we have 79 million that are in such situation, meaning that 1 in every child, every 2 child are actually directly endanger its health or safety. And this is really what's worrying, because we have a global commitment, we have legal binding legislation, but the practice does not follow. The third element is the workplace, which is quite important to understand the dynamic. Indeed, a major characteristic is that the largest majority of child labor actually take place within families, family work, primarily in farms or in micro-enterprise. So family-based child labor is actually frequently hazardous, despite the common perception that everybody has that the family offer a safer work environment. This is not true by what we have found. A fourth characteristic is the sector, and I think you mentioned it already. Indeed, child labor is largely predominant in agriculture. 70% of all children are actually working in agriculture, with child labor being 3 times higher in rural than in urban area. And this is of major importance when we talk about policy. And 2 other characteristics I want to point out is the age and gender, and also the geographic difference. And there, first, age and gender. The children in child labor are mostly young boys with a prevalence which is higher in all age group. And secondly, what is worrying also is that compared to 2016, the number of children between the age of 5 and 11 years old are rising, representing now 56% of all children at work. So, which means that the more younger you are, the more you're at risk of being in child labor. And this is extremely worrying because it means that younger children in child labor are excluded from school despite falling within the age of compulsory education. And that's really a trend that worries the ILO and UNICEF. And finally, and it's important, is the geographic difference. While we have seen in Asia and the Pacific and in Latin America, the prevalence rate and the total number decreasing over the last 20 years, including in those last 4 years, and that's obviously a good news. on the opposite, Africa in particular have seen a reverse tendency. And today, Africa, and in particular sub-Saharan Africa, account for 86.6 million, almost 87 million children at work. It means what? It means that sub-Saharan Africa represents more than all other regions combined. It means that almost 1 child out of 4 children in sub-Saharan Africa is working today. And this is really outrageous. And it's more outrageous that because behind those figures that I just quoted, and we will have the testimony of various panelists, including Molly, behind those figures there is faces of children whose future is really compromised. And there comes somehow the better news, I would say, not the good news, but the better news. And I wish to end up with this. The solution are known, actually. Although it's a complex issue and require both political courage and coordination among all actors, the solution exists. And it's even more important now that the figures that I just mentioned have been done before the COVID crisis. And it's more likely that, as you can imagine, that the impact of the crisis will have very strongly on most vulnerable and the children in particular. So what can we do? And we'll mention to finish, because you mentioned that we have 8-9 minutes. First, the pandemic has put an evidence that social protection is a core policy instrument to put in place. Even before the pandemic, actually, nearly 3/4 of the children, it means 1.5 billion, lack social protection. So universal social protection, and in particular child benefits, should be one of the core policy for the recovery process. Secondly, we have seen that schools closure tend to drive children into isolation and child labor. And often it's extremely difficult, once in child labor, to revert even when school opens up again. So that's extremely important, because even before the COVID, according to UNICEF, more than 258 million children and youth were out of school. But the solutions exist, and the report described it quite well, actually. For instance, aligning the minimum working age and the end of compulsory schooling, or abolishing some of the fees that the parents need to do, like the school fees or the cost for books, for uniforms, for transport, etc. So access to school is a key priority. Third, we have a debt, let's be very clear, towards the rural economy. If we truly wish to fight against child labor, it requires more spending and targeted intervention to provide to poor rural family with a decent work, with a decent wage, with livelihoods, and also the presence of public services, access to quality education, I mentioned, in rural area, access to health center, hospital, sanitation systems, and obviously social protection system. Very specific for rural area where lies the large majority of child labor. And fourth, and equally important, is also to recognize the key role played and should play the private sector, the trade union, and the civil society. Enterprise and their representatives are very much engaged to make sure that their due diligence obligations are put in place. They can probably do much more in the value chain globally and nationally. And also, substantial progress has been made, and we should recognize it, by the trade union and civil society who are at the forefront of this fight, especially in giving a voice to the voiceless, and in particular in rural area. And this is of particular importance in the framework of this webinar that you organize as the Center for Human Rights Advancements, but also global dialogue with everyone. So I will end by saying those things. The report obviously gives plenty of recommendation, but I want you to remember 3 things. We need really to act now. We need to act much, much stronger. and we need to act much faster if we really want to achieve the target 8.7 by 2025 and eradicate child labor. This is a promise that the whole community has done to the children, and really there is no time to lose. This is my last message. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philippe, indeed, for these very thoughtful, thought-provoking insights into the report and also into the situation regarding to child labor. I'm particularly glad that you mentioned the efforts of your noble organization, the ILO, right since its founding. I think you mentioned the first minimum age convention number 5, and then it was followed up by 1973 with the more universal convention. And there you began with a, as you said, a very on a hopeful tone that we have universal ratification for Convention 183 now. However, and that I think applies to all international, unfortunately, I repeat, unfortunately, many international conventions, that practice does not follow legal obligations. And that is an eternal challenge of humankind, I think, between and that the situation of children has deteriorated. I was glad you mentioned the specific impact of child labor within families, because this sometimes goes unnoticed. So that is a very important thing that you already said. And that, well, you said political courage and international coordination are the two building blocks if we want to achieve urgency of action to reach 8.7 SDG by 2025. And thank you so much for that. And I have now the honor to call upon our second renowned panelist, Mr. Tomoya Obokata, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery. Tomoya Obokata is a Japanese scholar of international law and human rights. He was appointed Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, including its causes and consequences, in March 2020. He currently serves as Professor of International Law and Human Rights at Keele University and previously taught at Queen's University, Belfast, and Dundee University. He therefore brings to us his in-depth knowledge of the subject at hand. Tomoya, your last report to the UN Human Rights Council focused on the COVID's impact on contemporary forms of slavery and slavery-like practices. You were also a principal investigator of the research project report, Good Practice in Protecting People from Modern Slavery During the COVID-19 Pandemic, which I believe has just been released. The report argues that the pandemic has had a negative impact on children, with temporary school closures having resulted in the growth of child labor in sectors such as agriculture, construction, mining, and domestic work, and online child sexual exploitation also increased during the pandemic. So could you please tell us as to what states in this light, or the light of these investigations and findings, could do to prevent and put an end to this negative trend? Over to you, Tomoya.
Great. Well, dear colleagues, and I'd like to begin by thanking the Geneva Centre for Human Rights Advancement and Global Dialogue for the invitation to speak at today's webinar. As already noted, in July 2019, the UN General Assembly unanimously adopted a resolution declaring 2021 as the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labour, highlighting the member states' commitments to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor and modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment and use of child soldiers, and by 2025, end child labor in all its forms. This leaves us, the international community, with only 4 years for action. 4 years to free 160 million children from child labor, including 79 million children who are in hazardous work, as highlighted by previous speaker. These are the latest figures by ILO, indicating that there has been an increase in child labor, including its worst forms, since 2016. And what I find particularly shocking, which has also been noted, by a colleague from ILO is the significant rise in the number of children aged 5 to 11 in child labor, as they now account for just over half of the total global figure. The COVID-19 pandemic unfortunately has forced more children into work. Temporary school closures combined with pressure from the sudden loss of livelihoods, food shortages, and breakdown of community safety nets. All of these factors have resulted in an increase in child labor in sectors such as agriculture, construction, mining, and domestic work in regions such as Asia, Africa, and Latin America. According to UNESCO, 11 million girls might not return to school after the pandemic-induced unprecedented education disruption. Indeed, I have seen instances of early and forced marriage, trafficking for sexual exploitation, domestic servitude, and other forms of exploitation and violence. For many girls, school is more than just a key to a better life. It is a lifeline. As my predecessor noted in her report on child slavery presented to the General Assembly in 2019, where children are not able to access education, their ability to understand, enjoy, and assert their rights both in childhood and in adulthood are impaired. So the longer we wait with bringing children back to school after the pandemic, the stronger the impact on their futures will be. And higher is the risk of more children being drawn into child labor. Child labor, which may amount to slavery-like conditions, is both a symptom and a driver of poverty. If children manage to escape their situation of enslavement, their prospects of finding work are diminished, making it very difficult to break free from poverty. Ladies and gentlemen, the task ahead of us is gigantic. There is no justification for putting our children and our future at risk. So there is no time to waste, and states must take renewed action without further delay. As noted by the colleague from ILO, last year a milestone and historic first was achieved with universal ratification of the ILO Convention 182, meaning that all children now have legal protection against the worst forms of child labor. In this way, the global commitment was reaffirmed that the worst forms of child labor, such as slavery, sexual exploitation, the use of children in armed conflict, or other illicit and hazardous work that compromises children's health, morals, or psychological well-being, are explicitly prohibited in all countries. This commitment, however, is not yet translated into tangible action by states, calling for urgently stepped up measures which go beyond the criminalization of child labor. Families need social protection and access to decent work in rural and urban areas in order to break the vicious cycle of poverty and child labor. And states must focus on the most vulnerable families as a matter of priority in order to ensure that no one is left behind. Without a specific focus on the most marginalized people, sustainable development goals remain an empty shell. Education needs to be a matter of priority at all times, including in times of crisis. In this regard, my colleague, the Special Rapporteur on the right to education last year, recommended measures including the adoption of the most accessible low-tech or no-tech approaches to distance learning and moratoria on the payment of school fees. It goes without saying that education must be provided to all children without discrimination of any kind. Furthermore, the root causes of child slavery must be addressed, including through comprehensive awareness raising at the national level on the rights of the child, and states need to strengthen their efforts to promote gender equality. Also, anti-slavery provisions should be included across wider social policies and programs so that child slavery concerns are reflected in areas such as education, social protection, labor markets, and labor standards. To prevent and end child slavery, states should adopt and implement time-bound, measurable, and realistic targets, action plans, and strategies, and allocate sufficient resources to this end. Finally, states should take effective preventive measures to ensure that businesses do not engage in child slavery, and in case of non-compliance, hold businesses and respective perpetrators accountable in line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Living up to the commitments made under the SDG Target 8.7 and the International Year Against Child Labour is only possible if states show real political will to change the status quo. Investing in children's future is investing in our planet, and inaction in this regard can no longer be justified. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed, Special Rapporteur Tawaya, for these very, I would say, precise remarks concerning some of the aspects of child labor and modern slavery. I was surprised to hear that a majority of the age group of children involved is 5 to 11, which is so young. I mean, it's really heartbreaking to hear that. And the connection that you made between child labor and poverty, it is also very important, as also the critical role of education. Education, as you have stressed, without discrimination, which unfortunately has been a result during and after the pandemic, as you rightly pointed out. And I'm also thankful, and we're all thankful for you for reminding us about the accountability of the business sector in light of the guiding principles. I think they have over 10 years now on business and human rights. So thank you very much for your statement, Special Rapporteur. I now have the pleasure of welcoming our next speaker, Mrs. Jo Becker, Children's Rights Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch. Mrs. Becker has for the past 20 years done research and advocacy on children's rights with a special focus on the recruitment and use of children in armed conflicts and exploitative and hazardous child labor. Her field investigations included Ghana, India, Indonesia, Iraq, Morocco, Nigeria, Sri Lanka. She is also Adjunct Associate Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Jo, it's a privilege to have you with us. Your report, co-written with Friends of the Nation, Ghana, and Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, Uganda, I think it's entitled, I Must Work to Eat, COVID-19, Poverty, and Child Labor in Ghana, Nepal, and Uganda, is truly an eye-opener. I know that for this report, 81 children from Ghana, Nepal, and Uganda were interviewed by the researchers. Based on the report's findings, could you, Jo, share with us how the COVID-19 pandemic affected child labor and poverty in these three countries? What was the impact on children's rights? And what were the government responses? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Umesh. And thank you to the Geneva Centre for organizing this important event today. I appreciate the chance to participate. As Philippe and Tamoya have already presented so clearly, I think it's of great concern that over the last 4 years, child labor rates have started to rise for the first time in 2 decades. But what's even more alarming is that the new global figure, 160 million, does not yet even reflect the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as Umesh mentions, I'm going to share some of our research about how the pandemic has affected children's lives on the ground. We know that the pandemic is driving child labor even higher for 4 key reasons. First is the unprecedented loss of jobs and income that have plunged nearly 90 million people into extreme poverty, leaving many of them struggling to meet their basic needs and often resorting to child labor. Second, as mentioned, the pandemic has brought massive school closures that have pushed 1.4 billion children out of school. And for those that can't access distance learning, which is about 1 in 3 children, work often seems like a logical alternative. Third, as of today, more than 3.8 million people have died from COVID-19 around the world. This has left hundreds of thousands of children without one or both parents. And as a result, many children have entered the workforce to support themselves or remaining members of their family. And then finally, restrictions due to COVID-19 have limited monitoring and enforcement of child labor laws, which has reduced pressures on employers to comply. So Human Rights Watch recently launched a new report documenting how these factors have played out in children's lives. Between January and March of this year, Human Rights Watch, Friends of the Nation, and Initiative for Social and Economic Rights interviewed over 80 children in 3 countries, Ghana, Nepal, and Uganda. We chose these 3 countries because each has made significant progress in reducing both poverty and child labor in recent years. And each is also a pathfinder country, which means that they've made an explicit commitment to accelerate progress to end child labor in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. But at the same time, each of these countries is lagging behind others in their region in using child benefits or cash transfers, which is a policy measure that we know can be remarkably effective in reducing poverty, child labor, and increasing school enrollment. Of the 81 children we interviewed, the vast majority said that their family income had been negatively impacted by the pandemic. Their parents lost jobs when businesses shut down, couldn't get to markets to sell their goods, or lost customers due to economic slowdowns. Families struggled to pay for food and other basic needs. Many children told us they felt they had no choice but to go to work to help their families survive. The majority of children we spoke to had limited or no access to distance learning during school closures, so had very little to occupy their time. A boy from Nepal told us there was nothing to do since school shut down. And with everybody at home, we started to run out of food. I decided to go to work because what else was I going to do? The children that we interviewed were worked at brick kilns, in stone quarries. They worked in gold mines, fisheries, in agriculture. Some worked as mechanics, rickshaw drivers, or in construction, while others sold items on the street. Many of the children described work that was clearly hazardous. The boy on the left is working at a stone quarry where children reported injuries from flying stones, including sharp particles that went into their eyes. The boy on the right works at a construction site where he was carrying heavy bags of cement up and down 4 flights of stairs, 10 hours a day. He told us, "It's so hard. Sometimes I feel drained, but I have to finish my work and earn my pay." In Uganda and Ghana, we spoke with children working at gold mining sites. They carried heavy loads of ore, crushed the ore into smaller pieces with hammers, breathed in dust and fumes from processing machines, and handled toxic mercury to extract the gold. Long hours of work were common, particularly during school closures and lockdowns. During Nepal's initial lockdown, several children said they worked in carpet factories for 14 hours a day or more. One 14-year-old girl told us she started weaving at her loom at 4 o'clock in the morning and didn't finish until 10 o'clock at night, with only an hour's break in the afternoon. Most of the children were paid very little for their labor, if they were paid at all. Some children said that their work did not, and their earnings did not even provide enough money for food, and that there were still times when they went hungry. More than a quarter of the children we interviewed said that their employers sometimes refused to pay them or cheated them of their wages. I remember one 12-year-old girl from Uganda who worked at a stone quarry, crushing stones for 7 hours a day and making barely more than $1 a week. And yet even so, her employer would sometimes pay her less if he was not happy with the size of the stones. Most of the children were eager to return to school as soon as they could. At the time of our interviews in January and February, most children in Ghana and Nepal had returned, but they continued to work either before or after school. Some said that their work hours made it difficult to keep up with their schoolwork, or that they were attending erratically because of their work demands. In other cases, children had not yet returned. because they believed that their families still needed their income or because they needed to earn money to pay for school expenses. One boy in Nepal told us that his parents had borrowed money when they had no work during the pandemic. And he said, if I go back to school now, my family is just going to fall further into debt. We know that the longer children are out of school, the less likely they are to return. UNICEF estimates that 24 million children that have missed out on schooling during the pandemic will drop out for good. And we saw that in our interviews as well. A few of the children showed very little interest in returning to school. For example, one boy had gotten work repairing motorcycles and scooters, and he said, I've spent so much time learning these skills. Why would I leave this to go back to school now? Our research paints a troubling picture, and the heightened risk of child labor is not going away. Since our interviews just a few months ago, both Uganda and Nepal are undergoing a second round of school closures and lockdowns due to rising COVID rates. But I think one of the most important messages for our discussion today is that child labor is not an inevitable consequence of the pandemic. When governments provide families with cash assistance or child allowances, this can help them meet their needs without resorting to child labor. We have decades of research that show that such cash assistance provided on a regular monthly basis can reduce poverty, reduce child labor, increase school enrollment, stimulate the economy, even reduce domestic violence. And of course, we know that cash transfers were an important element in the dramatic reduction of global child labor rates between 2000 and 2016. But despite their proven impact, 1.3 billion children, primarily in Africa and Asia, still have no access to such programs. And the assistance that governments have given in response to the pandemic has often been too little. Most programs have been short-term, averaging only 3 months, or consist of a single cash payment. Our report urges governments and donors to take immediate action to protect children. In line with the recommendations that we've already heard from my fellow panelists, we're urging, number one, that governments prioritize cash allowances and cash transfers in their pandemic response. This can alleviate the immediate and the long-term impacts of the pandemic and help families meet their needs without resorting to child labor. Secondly, as soon as it's safe to do so, get children back into school and make special efforts to reach out to children who are working and ensure that financial barriers do not stand in the way of their education. And then finally, enforce child labor laws through effective monitoring, removing children from hazardous labor, and applying appropriate penalties to employers. Our full report is on the Human Rights Watch website, and I'll also post a link in the chat. I look forward to hearing from the other speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that very interesting and thought-provoking statement that you just made. I mean, you underlined something that we tend to forget is the negative impact of the pandemic on families, and as a domino effect on pushing children into child labor on the one hand, and on the other, which is very important also, said that once they get some sort of a training in what they do under child labor conditions, despite the horrible situation of, as you said, the girl who earns just about $1 a week breaking stones, and maybe not even that if the employer thinks the stones were not broken in the right size. The point is that then they would say, why would you go back to school? And that is extremely detrimental. And I think in the countries of Africa and Asia and Latin America, that is something very important that has to be borne in mind. And also, as you mentioned, the regular cash assistance could help a lot the families, and therefore the prevent the domino effect of child labor being increased. And of course, and that was said also earlier by the two previous speakers, that unless you have effective monitoring of the laws concerned and sanctions, then we can't get really further. So thank you very much, Joe, for that. I now call upon our next speaker, Mrs. Anita Shet, Senior Advisor, Social Compliance and Development at Fair Trade International, which she joined in this capacity in 2009. She's the organization's expert on mitigating child labor and forced labor issues. Previously, she worked at Save the Children in Canada as its senior policy research advisor. Analyst, sorry. She has field experience in several countries, in West and East Africa, South America, Asia, and the Pacific. So that's a really vast swath of the globe. So Anita, can you tell us a bit about the Fairtrade's vision of developing a holistic approach to child labor elimination? And in particular, whether COVID-19 crisis has had an impact on the fair trade work. Thank you. Over to you, Anita.
Anita, you're muted.
Oops. Thank you. So thank you for inviting Fairtrade International to be part of these discussions. I'll begin by saying that the COVID pandemic has greatly increased economic, social, and environmental insecurity of farmers and farm workers around the globe, especially migrant workers and their families. Fairtrade Africa, our producer network in the continent, estimates that many farmers have lost up to 80% of their revenue. COVID has profoundly disrupted supply chains, impacted recruitment and employment practices for labor, and halted gains made. So what has the pandemic taught Fairtrade about the work we've engaged in thus far in eliminating child labor? To sum it up in one sentence, it has reconfirmed our position that systemic inequalities in the production, the processing, and the trading of commodities, along with unfair trading conditions, have been key drivers. As a result, we have seen 5 key things. Children's insecurities have accelerated on the one hand, and dependence on their financial contribution has increased on the other. Farmers and farm workers' declining income have negatively impacted their ability to act and respond to child labor. Focusing, therefore, not just on vulnerabilities of children and their families, but the economics of trade, the question that needs to be addressed is what is the shared responsibility and duty of care of all supply chain actors and their governments to address farmer poverty and enable a more equitable share in gains made. Third, children's education has not been regarded as a key priority in the time of crisis. So the question here to the UN and to child rights NGOs is why was the learnings and practices of children's right to education in emergencies and disasters not transferred to the pandemic context? Fourthly, while media stories and research generated information on child labor, sector-specific information throughout the pandemic, social support services were all shut down, making it impossible to safely withdraw children, even in the worst forms of child labor. And here, Fairtrade has a question to ask. What broke down in the national protection systems built over decades and supported by UN bodies and child rights organizations? Fifth, for most part, young farmers and farm workers impacted by COVID are left out of consultations on ways forward to eliminate child labor, even though their contributions to the production, processing, trading of agricultural commodities is constantly documented and reported. Given these 5 observations, then, the question Fairtrade asks, how do we factor it into developing a holistic approach to child labor? Firstly, we have learned how the issue of child labor is addressed is critical. Fairtrade has and continues to operate on a standard-based requirement that every child confirmed in child labor must be safely withdrawn to ensure prolonged safety. And taking such a approach during COVID has proved to be particularly relevant in the fair trade context. In further developing our community-centered, inclusive approach to child labor elimination, fair trade asked involved cooperatives to elect responsible and interested persons, women and young people among them, in their communities to support efforts to withdraw children identified by them or by anybody else in child labor. Once elected, we train them remotely on child rights and child protection, focusing on safe withdrawal. Once trained, fair trade required that these community support representatives engaged in safe withdrawal, document steps taken, and provide confidential reports to local and national protection authorities to independently verify them. Fair trade is exploring how involved farming communities and their trained representatives can play a key role in child labor remediation with governments and other expert agencies. Secondly, fair trade continues to address farming household poverty through fair trade minimum price and premiums, and we are currently engaged in pilots on living income reference points. This is critical as root causes, as a number of speakers have noted about farmer poverty. So we want to ensure that living income is obtained for farmers and farming communities. Fair trade has been working on living income pilot projects with committed, forward-looking commercial partners. We encourage more to join. Fair trade premiums have funded the building of schools, agricultural institutes, learning labs, provided scholarship, supported trainings of teachers and farmers on safeguarding, among other things. Thirdly, schools are not automatic safe places for children. Where child labor exists, chances are that schooling is absent, unsafe, or irrelevant for children's aspirations of securing a life free of poverty, hardship, and violence. Fair trade is thus engaging with child rights NGOs, education and labor departments of governments to work with labor inspectors and truancy officers to ensure that children withdrawn from child labor and placed in school live their lives with security, dignity, and respect. Fourthly, much of the work fair trade does in the area of child labor mitigation involves young people necessarily because we believe that they are resourceful and best placed to challenge traditional power structures and practices. We are lobbying for their inclusion in fair trade organizations so fair trade benefits can reach them. Fair trade is calling for all supply chain actors, child rights agencies, governments to enable decent youth employment, skills development, and business opportunities in the agricultural sector. We simply cannot end child labor without the involvement, leadership, and voice of involved youth. And I'll end with a quote. One 17-year-old youth worker reminded me in the early part of 2020 when the pandemic hit, and I quote, "What is happening in the farm is also happening in schools. The only difference is the people who do it have a better pair of shoes." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anita, for that remarkable statement based upon so many years of field experience and analysis. There are so many takeaways. I mean, when you said that the pandemic has reinforced the position that systemic inequalities and unfair conditions have been the key drivers. And I think that's very important to note. As also what broke down, then this is a very important fundamental question. What did break down in the national protection systems? Supported by the UN, supported by international conventions, or regional or national laws. You recalled very correctly the shared responsibility and duty of all supply chain providers. And that in the end, all of this has to be factored into policies, especially post-pandemic, to eliminate child labor, which would require coordination and leadership between all actors involved, including especially the youth. So thank you so much for those analyses and mentions. I now have the pleasure to call upon Mrs. Molly Namirambe, former child laborer, young activist from Uganda. Mrs. Namirambe is currently a program officer at Ecological Christian Organization in Uganda, where she's implementing projects that are aimed at ending child trafficking and child labor. She's a living example of resilience, as she's a former victim and now actively involved in global efforts to combat child labor. Molly, we are proud to have you with us today. Could you share your own story briefly of being engaged in labor activities as a child, as well as your personal stake on the importance of protecting generations of children from exploitation? And also, what are the additional difficulties faced while working on elimination of child labor in Uganda because of the COVID-19 pandemic? Over to you, Molly.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. And I really thank the Geneva Centre for Human Rights for this invitation to participate in such an important meeting. I'll begin with sharing my story and how I ended up into child labor. My father died before I was a year old, and my paternal family wanted to take custody of me. And my mother couldn't allow them to, so she took me away to a distant place and we started living there together. Unfortunately, at the age of 11, my mother passed away. It was the 1st of March. I still remember the date. Everybody promised to keep around with me and my sister at the burial. So we went back home, and the only thing we needed to do was pick tea, because we had a tea plantation just near us. So we went and worked with my sister. I personally worked part-time for about a year and a half, because I managed to stay in school. I got some support from my school. But after the end of the year, we needed more money for me to join the next level of education. So I decided to take full-time job at the tea plantation, thinking that I would be able to collect more money to support me to join another level of education. Unfortunately, this did not come to a reality, because the money we would collect was not enough for us to be able to eat, take care of some bills at home, and also support me to go back in school. So I stayed home and worked, but I didn't lose hope. I used to get books. I remember one of my friends that used to pass by at the farm every morning, and she kind of caused great pain to me, because I saw her living a dream that I wanted, but I never lost hope. So I kept going to her to borrow notes and revise her books to keep on track. But after some time, I realized it was going to almost a year and I had not gone back to school, and we didn't have any saving at all. So that's when I woke up and tried to trace my paternal family, even when my mother had taken me away. I used one of her best friends, and that's how I got to my family, and I was able to be supported to go back to school. Now, the key thing that for me, I think what I take from my story is that children need not to give hope, to lose hope. We need to empower them to remain with hope, because challenges will always be there. It could be about child labor, it could be any other form of abuse, but as a child, are they able to remain resilient to all these factors that are in their lives? And for me, I committed the rest of my life, and I have done it for all my working life now, to support these children to understand that some of these challenges will exist. The adults are not seated there working on it, but in the meantime, we have to remain resilient and we have to value education. Now, moving forward to my stake in child protection, I really don't think that we can be able to achieve, actually most, if not all, the Sustainable Development Goals by 2025 if we do not address the key issues of child labor. Because children are the future. And once we leave them exploited, unattended to, not able to get education, what is going to happen to their children, to the children after them, and eventually the next generations? So we need to act now to ensure that we put an end to child labor. And child protection is not just the right thing to do, but it's also the only human thing that we have to do. It's only human that we protect the children. I mean, we are adults, we are watching all this happen. So if we do not do this as adults, the children can't do it themselves alone. So we need to take this as our own fight and ensure that we eliminate child labor. Now, the question of what are we doing at Ecological Christian Organization, and this will take me to some of the best practices. I think it's time that we as actors, including government and civil society organizations, faith-based organizations, and anyone who is willing to participate in the struggle to end child labor and child trafficking, we need to stop treating these problems like as if they are happening in isolation from others. So one of our good practices is that we are implementing what we call PHE projects, population, health, and environment projects, where we are working with families that either have victims of child labor or human trafficking, or those that are at risk. And in our projects, we support them to, first of all, be able to be resilient to climate change, because some of the issues that we are seeing are actually on climate changes. For example, I saw a picture from, I think, Joe's presentation, and I'm sure the girl that was mining gold is coming from Uganda. So when I saw that picture, Karamoja is one of the areas where they are very much affected. So children are living there to go and work in the gold mines because of lack of food. So we should be able to support those families to be able to have food in their households, first of all. In Uganda, we get most of our food like from agriculture. Families have to practice agriculture to get food because we can't afford to buy it every day. So we are integrating livelihood where we support families with the
Yes, we are having, I think I was told we're having some connection problems with Molly. If you can hold on for a short while until we get her back. Thank you. Molly, can you hear us? Molly Namirembe, can you hear us? Has
Yes.
the connect? Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, my connection is now better. My apologies. Really, I tried to do my best, but I don't know. So I was still saying that we need to kind of have integrated projects to end child labor and child trafficking. And this must include livelihood. This must include family planning or the health of the people. And this must include the issues of the environment. Because child labor is not happening in isolation from the other challenges that we have all over the globe. Now, one of the other best practices is the use of the SCREAM approach. SCREAM is supporting child labor, supporting child rights through education, the art, and media. Now, we support children to be able to come out. One of the people mentioned, I think the previous speaker mentioned, that sometimes it's not easy to come out of child labor. And when you come out, it's also not easy to cope with the new environment now. So we use the SCREAM approach. When we identify children who are already in child labor, we get them out. We take them through what we call a bridge camp, where we train them. We go through career guidance session for them to be able to choose. Do they really want to go back to the formal education? Can they take on skill development? If that's the line, what kind of skills do they want? What passion do they have? In what learning environment would they love to be? So we use this bridge camp, which is packed up by 12 sessions, to be able to prepare these children for a life of rights fulfillment. In addition to that, we are telling them that some of these challenges are not able to go, but how do you maneuver? How do you as a child be able to speak about the issues that affect you? And we have moved ahead with some of these children to advocate for policy, for change in policy environment. I can give an example in Karamoja. I'm sure that photo was taken from Rupa because I know the area very well. And we've been there to have a biro, because that's more like a mining area full of gold, but the people there still remain in poverty. So we are supporting the children to be able to advocate. Can they be able to advocate for the private sector to be able to support some of the children who are in child labor? And just last year, we got one of the private sector companies paying Rupa sub-county over 300 million Uganda shillings, which was used to support over 15 former child laborers to go back to school. So we are working together. We are showing the children that even when you are the one in exploitation, you must be able to take part in the struggle to end this vice. Finally, some of my recommendations, I'll move to my final bit because we lost some time. Finally, one of my recommendations is to ensure that together as stakeholders, we take note of prevention and responding. We have taken so much time responding towards child labor, withdrawing children, taking them back to school. But most times, the people that we withdraw actually replaced by more from families where we did not take up preventive action. So this is something that we have to take on, prevention as a serious case. And this can be done through livelihood improvement. This can be done through mechanization. In Karamoja, the photo that was showed of mining, that water is not actually there naturally. That water is ferried to that place. So it's the children who carry the water. And we've been advocating to the government of Uganda. If the reason as to why the children are involved in mining is because there is no water, can we be able to provide boreholes at the place so children don't have to carry water? If children have to take part in agriculture to carry water for irrigation, and we be able to provide that water? Support in the work that children are supporting for serious mechanization and incentivizing of agriculture and other value chains of production in the different sectors. But on the other side, we are also advocating for civil society organizations to continue to emphasize the issue of families and parents drawing a thick line between light work that children can do at home and work that tantamounts to child labor. Because most of us think that child labor actually happens in factories and farms and where. Some of it happens at home. And in Uganda, so many children are exploited in child labor in the domestic arena, not even in rural areas, here in the city center and other urban areas. So we are trying to tell parents, to take employers, to be able to draw the line between work that children can do to grow up as responsible citizens, and they must know where to stop to ensure that their children are not exploited. Thank you so much, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Molly. We were very touched by your poignant testimony of your personal life at the outset of your intervention. And also by the very almost philosophical and moral statement that you made that children should not lose hope and that we need to empower them. The importance also of valuing education and of all the efforts that we can do in terms of prevention of child labor. We all admire your efforts. Thank you again for your statement. Our next panelist, Mrs. Flory Meitakang, is Executive Director of the Quagmire for Children's Rights and Social Development in the Philippines. For decades, she has spearheaded and managed different programs on upholding children's rights and developing the life skills of young people. She continues to advocate for child protection and strengthening related structures and mechanisms. Thank you, Flory May, for being with us today. Could you please tell us about the efforts implemented by Quagmire for Children's Rights and Social Development in protection of children that risk to be involved in hard and hazardous work, and perhaps share positive practices or success stories? Before I hand you the floor, I would kindly request you to limit your statement to 8 minutes for two reasons. One is that we are running really out of time. And secondly, as I'd mentioned at the outset, all statements, written statements, will be produced in full in the publication. Thank you. Over to you, Flory.
Thank you so much, Umesh. So allow me to present my presentation today. So I'm from Quagmire, and it's a non-government organization based in the Philippines. Okay, so our organization envisions a society respectful of children's rights, and our activity is geared towards protection of children against abuse and exploitation, particularly those involved in hard and hazardous work. So Quagmire has 6 core programs. It's organizing, capability building, direct service, research advocacy, networking and linkages, and organizational development. But I will focus more on the direct services and research and advocacy because this is the only thing that I will talk to you this afternoon. So Quagmire is a local NGO based in the Philippines, and particularly we are in the Mindanao. It's a one of the biggest islands in the Philippines. So we work with children in agriculture, mining, fishing, informal sector, construction workers, and domestic workers. So we organize also self-help group composed of parents of child laborers and at risk to child labor. This is an approach to empower women, which eventually result to their participation in establishment of child protection mechanisms in the communities. We also facilitated the formation on strengthening of community-based child protection mechanisms, as well as children's group and children's advisory committee. So the Children's Advisory Committee is part of the Dialogue Works. It is a global effort led by Kinder Not Healthy and 30 SOMs, together with other various stakeholders, in ensuring that voices of child laborer and working children are being heard in the political discussion up to the 5th Global Conference on Sustainable Eradication of Child Labor in 2022. To better respond to child labor and need of children, especially during COVID, in June last year, Quagmire, together with Kinder Not Healthy, conducted consultation with child laborers and their parents on the effect of COVID to their lives. Of course, because of lockdowns and quarantines, economic activities also stopped, which affect the lives of marginalized sectors. So parents lost their job, and because of pandemic, food is already scarce. Before the pandemic, food is already scarce for children and their families. This even worsened during the pandemic. So children could not help earn a living as they could not work, because aside from there is no available opportunities to earn something, they are not allowed to go out. This disrupted the usual activities of children. More so, they were unable to socialize with other children. A year after, we conducted another consultation on how children and their family cope with the challenges brought about by COVID-19. Parents have part-time job now, This is also true in some areas where Kaugmaon works. It was found out that in the study conducted by the organization under the Build Cup project of Child Fund Philippines, particularly in banana plantation, we found out that banana plantation ceased to accept seasonal workers since demand for banana in the global market also decreased. So despite engaging in seasonal job, still food is not enough for the family. Older children have the opportunity to work in construction sites. Sorry. However, some of the children drop out from school because they could not cope with the demand on modular mode of education, and some also prefer to help their family look for a living. Kaugmaon also conducted a children's rights situational analysis together with Kindred Not Healthy Philippines. So children expressed that life is difficult because of COVID, before COVID, but it's much more difficult during COVID-19, which forced them to engage in hard work just to earn. So they also experience health-related concerns like peptic ulcer, fever, cold, and body pains. And children also express that they are being bullied. After knowing the descriptive and qualitative data on the effect of COVID-19 to children and their families, Kaugmaon together with our partners, Kindred Not Healthy Philippines and Child Fund Philippines, conducted an enumeration of children who are involved in agricultural work, particularly in rice and banana, and also from other forms of work. So Kaugmaon continued to advocate in the recognition of child labor as an urgent exploitation issue that needs to be part of the priority plan of the local governmental units up to the regional and national level. As for the direct service, in relation to the support of children to education, Kaugmaon under the Build Cup project of Child Fund Philippines, with the support coming from U.S. Department of Labor, will provide education support to 1,500 children, which will be distributed next month. Furthermore, our partner organization, Kindred Not Healthy Philippines, will facilitate child sponsorship to 500 children for the next 5 to 10 years starting next year. As we recognize the magnitude of child labor problem and exacerbates during the pandemic, it is just right that networking and linkages among various stakeholders that address issues on child labor be established and strengthened. Child labor should be tackled in various levels of socio-political spheres from community, cities, region, and the global context. As the number of child labor increased during the pandemic, we need to double our efforts to address child labor, widen collaboration, and meaningfully discuss the issue so that appropriate intervention will be afforded and to exploited children. We should not take child labor as simply economic survival initiative of children, but an exploitative condition and a serious violation of children's rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Flory May, for your very interesting statement, which calls upon us to look at your website of your organization and see how you have put all of this, implemented this to practice. Without much ado, I will, because of the shortage of time, go on to our last speaker. Last but far from the least, I am privileged to welcome to the panel our special guest, who's a 14-year-old. We are truly humbled, Stacey Frew. She's the current face of the African Union and ILO's 2021 international campaign for the elimination of child labor. She runs the Stacey Frew Foundation that reaches out to donate books, food, computers, and other items to children and care homes across South Africa. So Stacey, could you speak about your recent book, Where is Tammy? And the work of your foundation in advocating for education and safety for all boys and girls within the limited time of 6 or 7 minutes. Thank you very much. Stacey, you need to unmute.
Oh, wow. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for that. Thank you for that introduction. As you all know, I am a 14-year-old from Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm an international multiple award-winning child author of chapter books, a philanthropist, activist, analyst, brands champion, and public speaker. My work as a child's rights activist positions me as the current face of the African Union and the International Labour Organization's 2021 Elimination of Child Labour. It is very disheartening to find out that 1 in 4 children in Africa, due to the pandemic, is in fact engaging in child labour. I am also the founder of the Stacey Free Foundation, which advocates for literacy, safety and security for children and adults. Through my foundation, I give underprivileged and inaccessible children things in the form of books, clothing, computers, food, and learning sessions. I run a few projects, including the African Book a Child campaign, in which I collect and donate books which are given to me by other African authors or books about Africa to children in underprivileged schools, homes, and communities. I have focused on teaching African children because when I was 8, I was extremely disappointed to have learned that many children my age and in my beloved continent could not read or write by the age of 12. So I teach, motivate, and encourage others through my public talks, through my writing, and my online TV channel called CTV SA. Mind you, children in Africa and in many parts of the world are very, very vulnerable. I have written 5 chapter books and is still currently writing. My first book, titled Smelly Cats, focuses on family issues. I use the life of these cats to portray and show how cousins compete for friendship and attention. In my second book, Bobbin the Snake, I tell of a boy's relationship and his closeness to his pet snake and how he had to make it through a tough decision, in his opinion, of choosing to respect his parents and follow his needs. My third and fourth books are both adventures. In Smelly Cats on Vacation, a sequel to the first one, the cats go on holiday and enjoy the beautiful country of Namibia. In Tim's Answer, a South African boy sets out to explore the world, traveling to Europe and America to find his role model. Unfortunately, he found none. He came back to South Africa after a long journey and many weeks to find his role model was living in his neighborhood. Tim's Answer is well received that Blind SA made it available in Braille and in DAISY formats. Today, I was requested to give an insight of the book, my book, titled Where is Tammy? In this book, I endeavor to communicate to individuals, institutions, and governments that many other children, including the 6-year-old Tammy, the main character in my book, depends on the grown-ups around them to become grown-ups themselves, meaning that only adults can provide a safe and secure environment for children. Unfortunately, in the book, like many other children, Tammy was taken away by strangers. As he walked beside his father, in fact, take away in this book, that means that Tammy was kidnapped. Although Tammy was reunited with his father later on in the book, what I put across in this book is that it matters for children to be protected by their dear ones. Children's safety and security should come first at all times in different situations. I remind grown-ups that child kidnapping is real and that it can happen within seconds. What really happens to many kidnapped children out there, I urge you all to learn about it and advocate about it. Read my book for more details. And my immediate call is that you should play your part. Make the world a better place for children to thrive in. I consider Tammy extremely lucky to be reunited with his family because many children are never reunited with their loved ones after they are kidnapped, abducted, or trafficked. Many are enslaved and forced to do laborious work. In closing, I will join many to acknowledge that the COVID-19 pandemic has affected household earnings. This means that children will suffer even more. Therefore, I plead that individuals should not let child labor make the situation worse. I call on adults across the globe to play very, very important roles in avoiding child labor by protecting children from any employment of any sector, including homes and in farms. Protect children against abduction and trafficking. I thank you all.
Thank you, Stacey. We are all in admiration of all the work you're doing, and you have our full moral support and wishes for success in your noble endeavors, whose goals we all share. I have, for the Q&A session, because time is short, just 2 questions from the floor to the panelists. What I would suggest, technically speaking, is I will just read the question, and then whichever of the panelists wants to take the floor first can just put up his hand and then unmute so that all don't unmute at the same time. So here's the first question: is what could be the role of faith-based organizations in the fight against child labor and promotion of the access to education? Who would wish to take the floor on that one among the panelists?
I am here to do so.
Please go ahead.
Okay, and I think faith-based organizations, first of all, have a platform because faith-based organizations have a huge following. So one of their key roles should be basically about awareness raising about the dangers of human trafficking as well as child labor. Awareness raising about the legal implication of employing children below the age of 18 or 16, depending on where you are. Awareness raising on the role of community, the role of the following, the role of the changed, the saved who are following these faith-based organizations. So I have a feeling that they should use that platform, of course, to preach about God and whatever else they have to do, but to raise awareness about the dangers of child labor and how communities can be able to support.
Thank you very much, Molly. Any of the other panelists would like to express himself or herself? If that is not the case, I will go to the next question, which is a rather classical question, I would say, is what are the ways, how is it possible today to oblige states to enforce principles that already existed for so many years and have acquired universal acceptance and recognition? Who would like to take the floor? Okay, Philippe, over to you.
Thank you, Umesh. Well, first, a quick note on the first question on the faith-based organization. I raised a hand but couldn't. Just to mention, additionally to what was already said, the Pope Francisco expressed himself today during the World of World Summit that we organized in the framework of the international conference in June, which is currently taking place. The recording is available, and he made a brilliant speech about the very nature of work and the decency that needs to be sought. And I think indeed, as it was mentioned, the advocacy role, but also the promotion of having a more human-centered approach in the economy and the role of the different organizations, that's what the faith-based organization can do. That's one thing. And so just today, the Pope expressed himself at the ILO. Secondly, I mean, what we can do to enforce states to do what is legally binding, if I understand the question. I mean, it's not a question of forcing. I think it's a question of vision of the society we want for our future. And what we put clearly is decent work is probably the instrument that put the human being at the center, and work is at the center of our preoccupation. If we have policy that enable to be protected along the line, along the life from our childhood, when we are active and when we are retired, through some, for instance, child benefits when we're young, or access to health insurance when we are adult, or pension when we are retired, that's a very effective means to reduce vulnerability and poverty. Secondly, in society, we need to talk and dialogue. The opinions are diverse and opposite, and this is normal in every society. And the ILO, by its tripartite nature, is pushing for entrepreneurs and enterprise representatives, for the civil society and the workers, and for the government to talk about the society they wish and define those policy as a social contract they want. And the children, who are the future of every nation, should be at the center of the preoccupation of the policymakers. So, I mean, it's probably a political answer, but the concrete things is, it's not to force, it's the vision that the society wants through democratic process. And dialogue is a key role. And I know it's complex, but that's the strategy and the way the ILO is pushing forward. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for that rich and thought-provoking response, which will make us think more as to how to go about addressing this very complex problem of state compliance with international regulations, which is a paradox and a contradiction in itself, because they are the ones who take upon themselves the obligations. Thank you. Would any other panelists like to take the floor on this? Tomoya, over to you.
Just very quickly, from the practical point of view, I think those are the vision and so on talked about Philippe is quite important. But from a practical point of view, then, like many of the countries where you see cases for child labor and slavery, but mainly in low and medium income countries, which are actually struggling to deal with issues. So what I suggest then is that what I want to stress is the importance of international cooperation. The high-income states should be able to assist these states so that they can develop appropriate measures to, for economic development, eradication of poverty, so that children would not be put in that kind of situation. So I think the importance of that international cooperation and of the international community should be also emphasized. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tomoya. I see Anita and Joe have raised their hands. So to be fair, since there's not one man and woman, I can't be gender favored. So I will go by alphabetical order. Anita.
But Joe, you raised your hand before me. So what do I do? Should I go? All right. I'd like to address this question. For decades, we've been counting the number of child labor present in sectors, in countries. The ILO and UNICEF receive these numbers, contribute to these numbers. I'm having a conversation with governments and companies asking the question, why are we counting? We are counting to do something. And what is that something? And I'm hoping, and FEDRATE's position is, those that count are obligated to remediate, to withdraw, because we all have responsibilities to focus on remedy. I know counting calculates the investments made by governments on development projects and the status of child labor numbers up and down. But the question we should now move into post-COVID is, why are we counting and what is our responsibilities? Whoever we are, whether we are a fair trade, the media, the government, the ILO, UNICEF, child rights organizations, when we count and report, what is our obligation to contribute to remedy? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anita. Joe.
Thanks. there are a lot of dimensions to this question, right? But 2 points I'd like to make is first, I think we need to do a better job of emphasizing why ending child labor is in countries' self-interest. Some of our speakers have spoken about the generational aspects of child labor and poverty. And I think we need to really continue to emphasize that when children are removed from child labor, when they're enjoying their right to an education, it really enhances the economic prospects of the country, development, and long-term societal benefits. But second to that is just going off of what Tamoya said about international cooperation. We know that many low and middle income countries don't necessarily have the resources that they need to put strong social protection systems in place. And yet we know that this is essential to buffer financial crises that families experience in times of pandemic or other difficulties. And so, having this a priority from wealthier countries, and I think we need to really promote the proposal for a global fund for social protection so that, governments can really support low and middle income countries in putting that safety net in place for families who need it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo. Well, with that, we come to a conclusion of this very rich panel discussion. The Geneva Centre thanks the esteemed panelists, for your very valuable contributions, and also the participants for their high interest. This would, I'm sure, go a long way in implementing all the rich ideas and recommendations made here. As I had announced at the outset, the Geneva Centre will issue a publication on this panel event in the coming weeks, pretty shortly, to enable which we thank the panelists, for those of them who haven't yet done so, for submitting their written statements at their earliest convenience so we can put them into the publication. We're also happy to announce that the video of the event will be available shortly on our website and put on social media. So once again, a heartfelt thanks to all of you and wishing you a safe and enjoyable summer